And you're in North Carolina, is that correct?
I'm based in North Carolina.
Okay.
Sinead's in New York.
Okay. Okay.
And I guess, there's a lot to talk about, but one of the things that I could personally use is like sort of this basic top level overview on how this technology actually works in mice so far.
Well, so I assume we are beginning the recording here, right?
Yes, we are.
Okay.
No pressure though.
No, no. I mean, it's hard to pinpoint the beginning of this story, but I would say it probably dates back to about 2009 or thereabouts. And if you had to assign credit where credit is due, this, at least at the outset, was largely a Japanese undertaking, almost entirely, and almost entirely, initially at least, from a single laboratory at Kyoto University in Japan. Later on, and I'll try to spell out the evolution of this, um, two of the lead individuals who began the process together, one more senior than the other. So the more junior individual, whose name is Katsuhiko Hayashi, carved out an independent position in a different university and continued what ended up being an equally productive career, following his collaboration and coexistence in Kyoto with Michinori Saito, who was in many ways probably, how shall I say, the originator. If we had to pick one, I would have to say that in terms of in vitro gametogenesis, Michinori Saito is probably the person who started driving this field. As I said, he worked closely with Katsuhiko Hayashi, who then struck out on his own and is contributing independently to the field. That's not to say that they are the only people who have contributed to the emergence of this field, because there had to be a lot of background information generated before they could do what they ended up doing and are still working on. It might be also of interest to your listeners to realize that both Michinori Saito and Katsuhiko Hayashi trained in the same laboratory in the United Kingdom, wherein the biology of germ cells, eggs and sperm, was highly evolved and internationally recognized. So both had the same kind of training. They moved back to Japan and carried on using this insight, but needless to say, contributing dramatically beyond what they've learned and taking the field to heights that most of us really could not envision at the time. I will add to this that my awareness of this, I will call it revolution, if I may, dates back to approximately a decade ago. And so much so that when I was in Japan, for other reasons, in 2013 or so, I made a point of booking a flight to Kyoto and to arranging a visit to the lab of Michinori Saito, who at that point was still working together with Katsuhiko Hayashi. And indeed, I ended up in Kyoto and in the laboratory where we had a very pleasant conversation around the laboratory table, and sort of stayed in touch ever since, mostly long distance, although Katsuhiko Hayashi came to the United States on several occasions. And on at least one of those, I think I met him in person. By then he was on his own, independent of Michinori Saito. It might also be relevant to the listeners to realize that Kyoto was not an accidental location for in vitro gametogenesis. Kyoto is also home to the Nobel Prize winner who developed the very notion of so-called induced pluripotent stem cells.
And I'd love to know like how that works, if you don't mind. Like I've read about it, but just
right.
from your perspective, can you explain that? And then actually how it led to IVG, like
right.
the connection.
Right. Let me just say, so I don't forget, that
sure,
because of this individual who received the Nobel Prize in 2012, I might add, there is a stem cell institute at Kyoto University, which gives you, I think, some sense of the intellectual environment in which IVG was born and raised. They had at the backdrop an institute, at the backdrop a Nobel Prize winner. And then they took those discoveries and those resources, in their particular case, towards in vitro gametogenesis. But this may be a time to go back to your question. But before I do, I will say that we are speaking today about in vitro gametogenesis. But the big picture is that stem cells that are essentially undifferentiated, unassigned, if you will, all-purpose kind of precursor cells could go anywhere. They could develop into a cell that is missing, let's say, in the retina of the eye and cure blindness. They could potentially be driven towards becoming a neuron and producing dopamine, and thereby maybe curing Parkinson's disease. Or they could be driven towards a neuronal fate of a different kind, a motor neuron, and thereby cure paralysis. And you can imagine virtually any other application which is made feasible by the fact that the starting material, the induced pluripotent stem cells, and we'll come back to that in a minute, can be guided if you know the instruction book, can be guided towards multiple fates. And that's really what's big about this field. And in vitro gametogenesis, in this respect, is but one facet of a much broader field that has huge implications to human health and disease. Now, back to how this worked out. So the Nobel Prize winner, whom we mentioned, essentially identified, when I say, and this was labor-intensive and took a long time to arrive at, but identified a relatively limited series of cellular components that are responsible for the differentiation of a cell towards a different fate. And he essentially tested those by injecting cells and documenting in a seminal paper, which I think was published probably before 2010, that you can take a precursor cell that is a skin cell and take it in a variety of directions. This is known as induced pluripotent stem cells. There's also another variety known as embryonic stem cells, which require embryonic tissue to be derived, which in the United States, as you know, is challenging. Although the original observations were made with frog embryos, in other words, it's not species specific, but if you wanted to use human stem cells, there'll be some issues that one would have to tackle. The simpler way forward, at least from an environmental point of view, political environmental point of view, is to use somatic induced pluripotent stem cells, such beginning, for example, with the skin cell and going from there. So this is really sort of the backdrop to what's been happening now over a good decade, perhaps more. Gradually, I think the scientific and non-scientific community were beginning to appreciate that this was happening gradually, almost imperceptibly in the background. So much so that I think it was 2021 that Science magazine dedicated a full spread to in vitro gametogenesis. And a year later, the New England Journal of Medicine, which is equally distinguished, but is more on the medical side of things, also carried a review on aspects of in vitro gametogenesis. And so it's been on our radar collectively now for some time. And I've been working as a member of the National Academy of Medicine. I've been working with their staff to put together a conference where the main challenge, as you can imagine, or one of the main challenges, is to underwrite it. And so it's really finding sponsors who would support such a conference. Speaking of North Carolina, Burroughs Wellcome, which I believe is in North Carolina, was one of the sponsors of the meeting. So this, I think, more or less gives you, as best I can tell, some sort of background as to how this sort of evolved. You could say out of left field, but imperceptibly in some ways, without most of humanity being cognizant of it. But I think a conference like this, although it's very topic specific, I think may have given the general field of the possibilities with stem cells a significant push. And it's inevitable that more will be learned and heard about it, and that other conditions / diseases will be beneficiaries of this breakthrough. I mean, I don't want to put relative weight on reproduction versus paralysis versus blindness. These are all important issues. We happen to focus on reproduction, but the implications are in so many ways much broader. And when I closed the meeting, I used the term historic to denote the fact that we are witnessing a breakthrough the likes of which we haven't seen for a long time, the implications of which to human health at this point are somewhat unimaginable and yet to be documented. But the potential is undeniable, and one has to be blind not to appreciate that we are living through a very special time in this respect. And likelihood is that you will have similar sessions in the future on different facets of stem cell technology. And it's really, in many ways, very exciting and gives rise to optimism that
Yeah, go ahead.
issues that have been heretofore unresolvable due to simply lack of means could potentially be addressed. And today we can limit ourselves to reproduction, but I think it's very important to recognize that this is much bigger than that.
Yeah, that's a great point. And thanks for that. Sinead, I just wanted to give you a chance to hop in if you had any questions. I've got more, but
a quick question. Do you think that the challenges of IVG and kind of stem cell evolution are more technical in nature or actually more social and cultural?
I think technical. I mean, I think the transition from, let's take in vitro fertilization, for example. I mean, right now, if a couple seeks a resolution to their infertility through in vitro fertilization, it's a cumbersome process. The woman is being injected with hormones that are designed to stimulate ovarian egg production. She is then subjected to a surgical procedure to retrieve those eggs. Then those eggs are cultured in a laboratory and fertilized, and ultimately an embryo is transferred back. Now, if you could convert this cumbersome, demanding, time-consuming, uncomfortable, not to mention expensive process to a laboratory procedure, I think it will transform this field in ways that are at this point difficult to envision. There's a huge enterprise of in vitro fertilization all around the world now. It's highly commercialized. And that may well change, although it might only be a decade or two or more from now. I cannot foretell the future. But if in vitro gametogenesis is fully realized, and I should say that it's not yet fully realized in the human, we have, for all practical purposes, demonstrated its feasibility in the rodent. But one has to really be very careful in leading your listeners to assume that we have worked out everything as it relates to the human situation. That's not the case. So more work is still necessary. But because it's been shown to work in its entirety, meaning from a skin cell to the delivery of pups in the rodent, there is no reason in principle why this could not be in time worked out, figured out, and applied to the human. So speaking of reproduction, I mean, this is a whole new way of going about having children.
Mm-hmm.
who would have imagined that we would start with a skin cell or something like it? And who would have imagined that as a result, we could, likelihood end up with an unlimited number of gametes, oocytes, or sperm. I will also mention, you may have seen this also, and this happened really just a month or so before the conference. A paper came out in Nature, senior authored by Katsuhiko Hayashi, which demonstrated the ability of taking skin cells from men and converting them into eggs, not sperm, which has implications for same-sex reproduction, for example, with all kinds of social and legal implications. So that was yet another twist that wasn't even thought of before. But the gay community is also a beneficiary of this approach. It hasn't been applied to women in a lesbian relationship yet, but I don't see that will be a limitation. I think it's just a question of time before the reverse phenomenon is worked out. So as people like me look at this, it's hard to find the appropriate description, but it is mind-boggling, earth-shattering, however you wish to characterize it. It's the kind of breakthrough that you hope for, but often don't dare to imagine.
And given that IVF almost never happened based on the cultural response to it at first, and the kind of blocking of funding and the banning of it in Congress, and I think it was just those few doctors in England that continued to persevere. Do you feel like we were at a good cultural moment to incubate this technology? Or do you think, based on more recent events and current polarization dynamics, it's kind of it adds more challenges to viewing this as a breakthrough versus some other kind of conspiratory dilemma?
Actually, I think we're in a very good position. My view of how IVF fits into our pro-life, pro-choice debate, shall we say, is that it is generally treated well. There have really been no restrictive statutes issued over the last 42 years, which is how long we've had IVF in the United States. And much of it has to do with the fact that I think every congressman or woman, every senator appreciates what it means to start a family, have a family. And this is in so many ways a pro-life technology, which is why I think it's never been really a significant issue for our national legislators. I refer you to the book that just came out, authored by our former Vice President, Mr. Pence, wherein he discloses, first of all, that all 3 of his children were born by IVF. That's not widely recognized. But he goes on to say in the book that, in his view, IVF deserves the full protection of the law. All of which I think gives you a sense that IVF is somehow divorced from the pro-life, pro-choice debate. It really never was in trouble that way, and it doesn't seem like it will be. because what is it about humanity, after all? What is more fundamental to humanity, let's say, than reproduction, right? That's what, in a way, we're all about. That's why presumably we are on this earth to begin with, thanks to our own mothers and fathers. And we are all links in the chain in that respect. And Congress has never really bothered to interfere with this because of a sense that this is the right thing to do.
Yeah, it's almost surprising how, I guess, unregulated IVF is, right? It's like people were scared of it at first, and then it just kind of quietly became part of the norm, which is interesting.
Right. I mean, I wouldn't say it's unregulated, but it's not
It's not restricted.
Not subjected to the same. Now, I should say, of course, the issue of embryo disposition is more problematic. And I don't want to misrepresent that. But if embryos were simply frozen and left untouched or adopted, that too would not, bring IVF to the attention of lawmakers. But if there is an issue in IVF, it is really about the fate of embryos in the long run. Although that too has never really been the subject of any legislation that I'm aware of. At the federal level, there definitely are laws in the book, including new ones, that deal with this issue at the state level. There are many examples of that.
That's all the questions I had for you. Sinead, anything else from you?
No, I guess maybe just out of curiosity, do you see this technology as helping us as we evolve maybe into space, a future where we kind of create the embryos or we send them to different solar systems and things, and maybe artificial womb, and that's how humanity continues to evolve?
Well, there's no reason why reproduction should be precluded from our space ambitions, naturally or otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
I think your other question, remind me, was related to that, but what were you saying? Just so I can, because I thought that was a good point you made.
About the cultural challenges of it, or about space evolution?
Yeah, I mean, I think as we discussed today, it shouldn't be a big cultural transition here. My sense is that most everybody can see that this is just another step in artificial reproduction, and that has positive and additive features to what we had thus far.
Mm.
So I don't really know that will present an issue per se.
Right.
This is all done, of course, with private funds. In Japan, it's done with government funds, but in the United States, most of this work may require private funds. And there are, as you know, several companies now that exist in the Silicon Valley area that are trying to make this a commercial enterprise. They have significant backing, financial backing. And so things are proceeding in the United States as well, but mostly, not exclusively, in the private sector. There are some very significant investigators at UCLA, at Penn, and others who now work on this and participated at the meeting and were in fact members of the organizing committee. So it's not like it's now still exclusively a Japanese
Right.
invention, but you cannot help but feel that not only did they start the process, they are still quite dominant today and still affording us with breakthroughs that remain stunning today as they were before. As I mentioned, this idea of allowing a male orientation to give rise to eggs and thereby allow gay couples to procreate, that's still a Japanese invention. So we have to give them credit for starting the field, continuing to lead it, but at this point they have a lot of good company in the United States and elsewhere.
Well, thank you so much for this. This is really
Yeah, this is very
fascinating.
helpful.
And
Well,
we'll be in touch with you about how this episode goes. And I hope that if you don't mind, I may email follow up some questions with you, just as I'm writing the script.
we can try, although a phone call is always easier.
That's good to know.
Good
Yeah.
to know.
Well, thank you so much for your time
Thank you so